Hello and welcome back to these series of lectures on the Exalted Treatise on the response of the Tao. We continue exploring the third section of the Exalted Treatise, and we'll look at a couple of sentences discussing different misdeeds. So the first are these two sentences: the misdeed of acquiring and demanding by force, delight in imposing and seizing. So clearly there's a similarity here in taking things that are really not ours, not meant to be ours. First of all, if we look at the first part, what's the difference between acquire and demand? According to the collected commentaries, to acquire means when you're given something, whereas to demand is to request or seek of others. And clearly, to acquire or demand is not a misdeed in itself. It's only a misdeed if you do it by force. So what does by force mean? So it means that we take things that are not rightfully ours, it's not deserved, it's not meant to be ours. And it's not just money that we're talking about here. It could be fame, it could be some sort of privilege or benefits. Venerable Master Chin Kong, in his lecture, provides us with the Buddhist concept that encapsulates all the various kinds of demands or gains that we wish for in our lives. So he uses this concept of the 5 desires and the 6 data fields. We may have heard of the 6 data fields being translated as the 6 das. But essentially the 5 desires are as listed here. These are what were identified as quite as common to the human condition, and it's something that is instinctive, that you don't need to be taught, but that you'd have these 5 desires for wealth, sex, fame, food, and sleep. And you'd see that clearly most of the time people think about money, right? Because money or wealth can therefore facilitate and is the means for the other 4. So these 5 desires are things that would, I guess, hinder your cultivation and your pure mind. Similarly, the 6 data fields, why are they called the data fields? Is because they're sort of, as you can see, the first refer to our sense organs, right? Or the various senses. So the form, sound, smell, form, sound, smell, taste, and touch. And these are sort of the objects of our various sensory organs. And they're called fields because they're sort of where we gather our information. If you've learned science, you would know that what we see, what we smell, etc. They can all be boiled down into waves or chemicals, depending on chemistry or physics, and so ultimately they're sort of this data or information is what we pick up. And the 6th one is quite interesting. We may not intuitively think of it as associated with the sensory organs, but the conceptual field is this mind that we have, the thoughts and the thinking. So if we think about it, in the sensory information that we pick up every day and every moment is not something that we are necessarily concerned about. It becomes a problem, and I guess this so-called das is quite an interesting kind of word, because it's sort of the literal translation of the Chinese, is because it becomes a problem when you're attached, when you like or dislike, you become addicted to any of the data, this information, whether it's sight, smell, taste, etc. So you can imagine that if you become attached to certain tastes, certain foods, and then over time that might cause health problems like cholesterol. So it becomes a problem when you are attached, and this attachment is to be fond of, or in some way have this predisposition to this kind of sensation. So you can see that this becomes a problem. Now, going back to the line in the Exalted Treatise, we said that yes, acquiring and demanding is not a problem, but it is if you do it by force. Why would we want to do it by force? Is because it becomes we are seeking to gain something that we are attached to in some way. And more than just thinking about wealth or any sort of profit or privilege. Using this idea helps you broaden your mind to realize that actually it's relevant to all of us, and at any moment of the day we could be we could be prone to these 5 desires and 6 data fields. So like I said, it's interesting when you think about the literal translation of the 6 dusts, because it makes you think of, say, something like a clear, bright mirror that has been obstructed by a thick layer of dust. So our mind, our original true self, the self nature, is like a clear, bright mirror. We should have this clarity of mind, this wisdom, but it's been obscured or concealed by these dusts. If you want to use this analogy of the field, then you could say, well, our clear sense organs are distorted and distracted in some way by our attachment to the sensations. And it also, as you can imagine, directly affects our judgment. So that's why we avoid this particular acquire and demand by force. But this discussion has helped us realize that what we acquire and demand can be, the scope of it is quite broad. Now, this first line is closely related to the next, to delight in imposing and seizing. So imposing and seizing, to impose means to do things in an underhanded way, to provide some sort of secret or subtle pressure on others, whereas to seize is much more open, like openly bullying someone, like the picture here. And to do so using your authority, your position, power, or some sort of connections. So there's a difference in the imposing and seizing, although, as you can see, both are clearly negative. And in the Exalted Treatise, the many lines in this third section of misdeeds, we've clearly covered some that would involve this idea of bullying or imposing and seizing. Now, this line is quite specific because it's not just talking about that misdeed, but the fact of delighting in it, the taking delight, enjoying imposing and seizing, and being cruel to others. So that's the problem. That's how the misdeed occurs based on this line. Now, having said that, these are misdeeds. But then how does it actually correspond, or how is it consistent with the principle of retribution? This idea of the universal principle of fairness in the universal order. The idea that we encountered in the very first line of the Exalted Treatise. The idea that, fortune and misfortune come about through one's own conduct, that we are the masters of our own destiny. That, if we do good deeds, then we will be rewarded with good fortune, health, wealth, etc. But if we commit misdeeds, the ones in this very long section, then we will experience negative outcomes, misfortune, of which there are also countless. So this is the so-called principle of retribution. And the Exalted Treatise, you could say the whole text, is there to help us understand the causes of one's fortune and misfortune by evaluating the various deeds, our own conduct throughout our lives. And of course, it says that, if we commit misdeeds, based on how many and the extent of them, then our lifespan, our health may be affected, our lifespan is shortened. But on top of that, it affects our financial conditions, our financial circumstances, our assets might be depleted. We might, have a life full of stresses, anxieties. We may be humiliated, have a poor reputation, suffer from other forms of penalties, and not feel any peace of mind or happiness, etc., etc. So clearly there are countless types of misfortune. Now, how does that then relate back to what we said earlier, that, if you seize or you impose or you take things by force, then doesn't that person immediately encounter misfortune? How can it still be possible that they are able to do so? Does that mean that this principle is somehow inconsistent? The answer is that the principle remains. How? Venerable Master Ching Kong explains that in our lives, we have this destined good fortune and misfortune. Right? And this is based on our own personal conduct, whether in this lifetime or in previous lifetimes that we obviously may not remember. Now, how it works then is that if we happen to take things by force, to gain, make demands, and achieve this salary or status through manipulation, through unscrupulous means, then the good fortune that we end up enjoying based on these, through our machinations, through our manipulations, is actually something that was in our life's destiny anyway. So, for example, maybe through our hard work, through our honest diligence, we were meant to be promoted and have a very high salary and good position, senior position at the age of around 50. But in our 30s, because of, our scheming, because of our manipulations, how we act towards our colleagues, creating networks, associations, etc. We take this position and therefore the salary by force. Then we actually enjoy the salary and position at the age of around 30. Okay, but actually this was actually part of our own destiny. It's just that we would have enjoyed it or experienced it at the age of 50 instead. So through these misdeeds, we actually sort of end up with this good fortune earlier. However, through committing these misdeeds, we accumulate demerits and sow the seeds for future misfortune and negative consequences. And on top of that, this particular good fortune, whether it's salary or status, may not be able to be sustained or preserved, or might not be enjoyed for very long. Just to use a very simple example, these days, of course, there's, we always hear about various scams, and scam prevention is quite important in the banking industry. Now, let's say, for example, we were thinking of trying to scam someone out of $10,000, let's say. Now, if we were able to actually scam them, then this $10,000 was actually part of our life's destiny anyway. But perhaps, we would have achieved it through our own hard work later in life. So if it was originally part of our life's destiny, we would be able to pull off the scam. Now, if it was not part of our what was in our fate, then what might happen is that before we are even able to action this plot, we may be discovered. We may be that something might happen in our lives such that we have to abandon that plan, that scheme, or we find no victims who are gullible enough, so we're not able to scam anyone. That's because it was not originally meant to be ours anyway. The other outcome is that, yes, we may be able to scam someone and the $10,000 ends up in our bank account, but those funds are not able to be enjoyed. Maybe in the short term, something happens to us within our family, within our own lives, to our property, that means that we have serious financial losses, and the money that we came into through these sort of unscrupulous means happens to be used up and squandered on these expenses. So it's medical expenses, etc. So you may be able to pull off the scam, but the money will not be enjoyed, cannot be enjoyed. And this comes out very clearly in a story of the collected commentaries. It's about a man, his name's Mr. Young. He's from a poor family, but one day he's quite old already. He's sitting outside on his front porch, and he sees that quite a wealthy lady walk across the road. She's hurrying, and what happens is that her hairpin falls out and drops onto the road, makes a loud sound even, but she's too preoccupied to notice, and she continues walking on her way. She's lost her hairpin. But in those days, the hairpin was actually made out of real silver. And so Mr. Young, who's observed all of this, quickly rushes to the roadside, trying to find this hairpin and pick it up for himself. What happens is that when he gets there, to his surprise, he doesn't see anything except a worm. And he says, trying to work out what happened to the hairpin, where did it go? There's a young man who was walking behind the lady who saw exactly the same thing, who reaches down and picks up a silver hairpin. Now, Mr. Young, who is, quite feels that the hairpin, he found it in the first place, rushes after this young man and tries to, argue that this was actually his lost property. The young man wants no bar of it, knows exactly what's happened, and just tries to tell him to leave him alone with, a few $100s, gives him some cash, and tells him to, buy himself some good food and wine and just enjoy himself. And this is what Mr. Young does. Except when he comes home with, the very nice fish and the nice wine that he picked up, what happens is, as his wife is about to cook that fish, the neighbor's cat comes in, grabs the fish, and runs off with it. And in the clamor, as they try to, run after this cat, they knock over the bottle of wine, and it gets broken on the ground. All the wine is spilt. At the same time, their, nice ceramic bowl that they were about to put the fish in after it was cooked also gets knocked over and gets smashed and broken on the ground as well. So, the very end of the story is that, not only has he not been able to come into, he's not able to gain the hairpin, but the cash that he gained and the food and wine that he was meant to enjoy, not one drop of the wine and not one bite of the fish is able to be enjoyed at all. Because, as you can hear from the story, that hairpin was not his, and nor was the money that he came into because he harassed the young man. So this account really brings to light the fact that what is meant to be ours is as part of our life's destiny are the only things that we can really lay claim to, and what we can really enjoy or use is what we deserve, what's meant to be ours. And of course, from a Buddhist perspective as well, this is only the kind of misfortune or negative consequences that we experience now. We may have, for example, in terms of the scam, people may be fined, imprisoned, face legal sanctions or social disapproval, humiliation, etc. But that's only what we might see. Say, for example, what we read in the news. The reality is that the consequences of our actions are also experienced in future lifetimes. And this is based on the extent of the harm that we've caused. Say, for example, if we've happened to scam a family and someone in that family commits suicide, then the harm is much more than just the money. It's actually this entire family's, that situation, those lives. So therefore, the consequences are not only experienced in this lifetime, but also in future lifetimes. So you can see quite clearly that not only is there no benefit, but there's also harm. We harm ourselves and our cultivation, our future, good prospects and good fortune. So how do we actually gain good fortune? As it states in the Exalted Treatise, it's through our own good conduct, our own good deeds. And at the end of the day, it's through our thoughts, because it's our thoughts that lead to our words and actions, our thoughts of others that are the source of all good fortune. And the results may not be immediate, but they will come. And that's this principle, this timeless principle of retribution. So not only is it wrong to take things by force, demand by force, seize and impose, but we have to think about it from the other end. Is to do those good deeds and to delight in those good deeds rather than delighting in the seizing and imposing. This also relates to these lines are also quite related to the following lines. As you can see, it states to achieve riches by pillage and plunder, and to achieve promotion by cunning and scheme. So here, the emphasis or the focus is obviously not just the means by which we achieve riches and promotion, but the aims of our actions, so the riches and promotions, the wealth, the status, etc. And again, it's undeserved. As you can see, it's through some sort of manipulation. You can see here this idea of becoming wealthy, the pillage and plunder. These words have, the semantic fields of these words is quite broad. It's not just to pillage, but to capture, etc., to take away. And similarly, to achieve this promotion in some sort of cunning, fraudulent way. So again, you can see that the way that it's done is clearly a problem with the way that we achieve promotion and riches. Now, to the perpetrators, to the people who are even thinking of doing this, as well as to the victims of cunning and scheme, pillage and plunder, there's a very good Chinese saying that will help us think through these issues. And it is that what is yours will come to you by natural course, and what is not yours to have, do not take by force. So, as I said, if you have been the victim of any kind of scam, or you felt exploited or taken advantage of in the past, and through various means you've tried to claim back your property to no success. Well, perhaps this may help you think your way through it, to realize that actually maybe that property was not meant to be yours in the first place, and it's not part of your destiny. There are two stories I'd like to share with you from the collected commentaries that were also that help to illustrate this saying and these ideas, because it's this underlying, it's not understanding this principle, it's not understanding the principle of retribution that leads people to take by force and pillage and plunder, etc. So the first story is from the 12th century. It's about the chancellor at the time, and this period of time in Chinese history was known as the Song dynasty. His name was Zhao Xiong, and Zhao Xiong, before he became chancellor, so this is the highest government position in the empire. Before he achieved this position, he actually came from a very humble and poor family, and he had to look after his family, his elderly mother. And one day, in his younger years, he's cleaning his courtyard and happens to come across a piece of silver. So it's a genuine, piece of silver, and it's in his own courtyard. So he uses it, and through that, he's able to. The family's able to live quite comfortably for a little while. And it's through this that he's able to invest in his own studies, which ultimately means that he's able to become a government official and ultimately rise through the ranks and become the chancellor. When he becomes the chancellor, his salary is 100 silver pieces. But he finds that he only is given 99 pieces of silver. Now, as he's about to write to the relevant department, payroll office, he has a dream that night in which Spirit tells him that the piece, he's destined to have 100 silver pieces, but actually one of those silver pieces had already been given to him on this particular day, particular year. And he realizes that it's that silver piece that he found many years ago. So you can see from this account that Zhao Xiong, this particular chancellor, but by extension, the idea of one's life's destiny, the idea that we are destined to have, a certain amount of wealth, a certain amount of a certain lifespan, etc. This is almost predetermined, and as he realized that the one silver piece that he had been given was part of this wealth that he would later achieve. So he didn't ultimately claim it. Again, this account from, you'd say, he had deserved that salary, but he realized that actually it was something that he'd already enjoyed or used. But the other account is from the negative perspective, and it's about a Mr. Lu. And this particular man is very cunning. He is able to scheme, scam, etc., and ultimately becomes very, very wealthy. Okay? He feels, of course, that he's above the law. He can do whatever he wants and get away with it. And he starts sort of noticing his neighbor's property. And he wants to expand his own property, his own land. And so he sort of comes up with various strategies and ways to actually cheat the neighbor of their land, their property, which they successfully do. Now, it's not recorded what happens to that family. It's a Jin family, surname Jin. But we can imagine that have that family being sort of cheated of their property. The family falls on hard times, etc. Now, what happens to Mr. Lu is that shortly after, he has a son. Now, the son is actually has this impairment. He's mute from the age of 5. They realize that he can't speak, and but in the childhood years, there's one day where he's sort of walking around in the family courtyard, and he sees a tree. And this tree is quite special because this tree was the only thing that was left of the Jin family property. You imagine, as soon as Mr. Lu got hold of their property, he demolished it, expanded his own, changed the whole face of that piece of land. But he did leave that one tree. And so this child on that particular day, he sees the tree and he suddenly speaks and he says one sentence. He says, "Oh, tree, you are still here." Immediately afterwards, he again is unable to speak. But this sort of makes the family have this great hope that perhaps their son can be treated. And so Mr. Lu spends a lot of time, effort, and money in trying to search the land of a doctor who would help his son. But there's no medical treatment that seems to be successful. And what happens later is that the son grows up. Obviously, he's not able to make a living for himself. But what he does do is he's able to, he has a very indulgent lifestyle. And he ultimately squanders away the family's property. And as soon as the family assets are depleted, the son passes away. And everyone in the community who has, seen what's happened, from the very beginning, they know this family, they know Mr. Lu, they know his son, etc. There's this, belief in the community that perhaps this son was a member of the Jin family, reincarnated to take revenge on Mr. Lu. So you can see that this son, he didn't have to work a day in his life. And yet all the property of Mr. Lu was something that his son could enjoy. And possibly, you would say, much of this property was based on the Jin family. And if, in fact, this family member was previously part of the Jin family, you can see how this son could have enjoyed this property because it was rightfully his. So, but on top of this, you can see, well, Mr. Lu, he might have been very wealthy, had much property, from all intents and purposes, from what people would see, but could he really enjoy this? To have a son like this, you can imagine that he was worried. He was, trying to find the right cure, the right treatments, to think about what more he could do for his son. And there would have not been a moment in his life, after having a son, that he was at peace. Because naturally, if his son grows up and is not able to be financially independent, he has to support his child their entire life. But what happens is that the child also becomes quite dissolute. And, the family has to fund his lifestyle. You can imagine Mr. Lu in his later years, when he's elderly, thinking about, oh gosh, how much money do I have for my son to use? How much more can I earn so that I can support my son? And he's not really able to have any peace of mind, the happiness. He's not able to enjoy any happiness from this wealth. Now, this wealth, part of it was obviously the Jin family's property, but also you can, as we know, this wealth. How did he come by his wealth? It was through scheming, scamming, and the lines we read before: pillaging, plundering, taking things by force, etc. So actually, this wealth was not really meant to be his, and therefore, although he had acquired it, perhaps it was in the bank account, he was not able to enjoy it. And this does have quite interesting parallels with Mr. Young's story, but that's perhaps on a smaller scale, the wine and the food. But in this particular story, you can see that his whole life is affected. And what we read before about the Exalted Treatise, all the different forms of misfortune that can beset the person who's committed these misdeeds. You can see that, I'm sure you can see that in the life of Mr. Lu. Whether it's the depletion of his resources, becoming poor because of his son, being humiliated, etc. So all of this is the misfortune that he encounters because of his own actions. So through these two stories, one is from the more positive perspective, Zhao Xiong, who was able to, through his own hard work, through his own diligence, achieve this great position, this salary. But, despite that, he's also, you can see quite clearly within the bounds of his own life's destiny. And similarly, Mr. Lu, you can see that principle of retribution coming into play in this very lifetime. Now, that's this idea of how what good fortune we experience and the misfortune that we experience are all related to our own thoughts, words, and actions. So as you can see here, this line, very common saying, and I use the picture of the road because it's like we're all on our own life's journey. We're all in the driver's seat. We also don't know what's around the corner, but the truth is that we can only focus on making sure that we abide by the road rules in the here and now. Don't think that we can speed ahead or break the road rules to get to our destination, because that might not lead us to our destination and put us in harm's way. So abiding by the principles, to work hard through our own efforts, through these thoughts, these kind thoughts, being able to attract this good fortune, and it will come to us naturally. Do not take it by force. We will move on to the next lines. And these are two misdeeds: to reward and punish without impartiality, to enjoy leisure and amusement beyond measure. Now, what's the common element in these two sentences? It's actually the last word. So impartiality and measure. And it assumes that, in our dealings with others and towards ourselves, there is there's a standard that we have to abide by. There's a limit. So just like the scales of justice, we also have to have measured reason in how we enjoy ourselves. We have to have measure. So these two sentences are juxtaposed because of this common element of having some sort of standard or limit. And I want to hone in on this and talk and sort of take you to explore the last word in the Chinese sentence, pronounced as jie. And what it is, and from the earliest Chinese dictionary, the Shuwen Jiezi, is that it originally meant the node of bamboo, of the bamboo. And you can see that it's related to the bamboo from the very word itself. So on the left here in the middle is the small seal script, the ancient script. And the top part, so you can see it's made up of various components. The top part, the two symbols that look the same at the top, the vertical line and the upside down curve, is meant to represent bamboo. Why? If you look at the top left picture, it's meant to represent the leaves that sort of drooped downwards, which is characteristic of bamboo, as well as, of course, we know the bamboo, the actual the tubes, the stems, but the Chinese took the downward curving leaves as characteristic of the bamboo. Now, that's why it's related to the bamboo. But the node of the bamboo, as you can see on the bottom left picture, is that horizontal line that sections off parts of the bamboo stem. This node is really interesting because it has various functions. The node, there's been research to show that it improves the sort of mechanical strength of the bamboo stem, that the bamboo grows to a certain height before it needs to create a node that then sort of provides added strength to the architecture of that stem. But on top of that, this node also has vascular structures that help provide nutrients and to the bamboo to continue the growth of that bamboo stem, which, as many people would know, is actually hollow inside. So that's very interesting of the bamboo. But why mention it? Is because this idea of the node later sort of had extended meanings. So the node here means that the growth of the bamboo stem is limited in some way. It can only grow a certain height, and that's different based on different species of bamboo. But this node is important in all bamboo. And what it does is, as mentioned, it limits the growth of that stem so that before more of the stem can be developed. Okay? So this idea of a limit or some sort of restraint leads to the following sort of extended meanings of this word. So the original meaning was node, and then it, as you can see here in the compound words that use this particular character, it has other ideas related to that idea of limiting. So it can be used for the word restraint. So obviously there's a restraint in the growth, for example, of that bamboo, but restraint generally. If we restrain or limit our spending, that is through, that's used to express the idea of frugality, this virtue, this Chinese traditional virtue, in which we spend less on ourselves. We limit our expenditure to save more in times of need or for those in need. So this idea of frugality is important. And then this leads to moderation in general. So not just spending, but also moderation in our lifestyle. Could be how we eat, how we exercise, how we work, etc., to ensure that there's a balance in the various aspects of our life. So this is also very positive, and it uses this word to be moderate. It's also used in the word for etiquette and also moral integrity. So you can see that this word, which originally meant node, but has this sort of connotation of limiting, restraining oneself, is actually quite positive and has led to a number of other words. And it's, I guess, I discuss this because when you think about the idea of the node or this limit, that is really the standard that that cuts across these two sentences. So whether we're talking about rewarding and punishing, there has to be some sort of standard, some sort of regulation or law that allows us to reward and punish impartially. And so it's the so-called scales of justice. And this idea was so important, obviously throughout Chinese history, in terms of government and how to be an official. And therefore you have many stories of this idea of impartiality. Just to give you an example of what this idea of impartiality meant, I'd like to share with you two stories. And these come from the text, The Garden of Eloquence, in Chinese, Shuo Yuan, which was written or compiled about 2,000 years ago in the time known as the Han Dynasty. But it basically sort of compiles anecdotes from before the time of the Han period, the pre-Qing period. Now, this story comes from the spring and autumn period of Chinese history. At the time before China was unified into the Qing Empire, and they were sort of autonomous states, feudal domains. This particular story relates to the state of Jing. And one of the sort of senior ministers, his name's Zhao Xuanzi, one time he recommends this gentleman, his name's Han Xianzi, to his ruler, the Marquis of Jing. And he recommends this person because he says, this Mr. Han is very fair in his dealings with his troops. And because of his fairness, they're very ordered. They're unafraid when facing death because they know that, if they do well, they will be rewarded. If they don't do their jobs, if they're not responsible, then they will face the punishment. So what happens is that the Marquis of Jing appoints Mr. Han as the commandant of the Central Army, so the most important faction of the army. During one of the resultant military campaign that same day, Zhao Xuanzi, his chariot driver, happens to drive through a line of troops. And now this is quite a serious military regulation, and so breached this rule. And Mr. Han, who's just been appointed, had the driver executed. Now everyone in the army, is quite worried, saying that, well, this person has just been appointed, and he's sure to, be punished, because his patron, the person who recommended him, Zhao Xuanzi, he executed Zhao Xuanzi, his driver. So clearly, he thinks that he's above even the person who recommended him. Surely he must, have some leeway for this person, return the favor at least. But actually, Zhao Xuanzi is not worried at all about this. And that night, he's very, very happy and he's celebrating. So he's serving wine to his officers. Now, this doesn't happen every day. And he gives them like 3 rounds of drinks. And he says, there's something that you should congratulate me for. He's so happy. And all of his officers are not really sure why he's so happy. And Zhao Xuanzi explains that he recommended Han Xianzi. And clearly this person was very fair. He said, today my chariot driver broke through the line of troops, breached this military rule, and this Mr. Han had him executed, even though he was, my very driver. And this shows that he is impartial. and therefore my recommendation was correct. So he's actually very happy that Mr. Han actually, accorded with the letter of the law and was able to do so despite the fact that it was his driver that breached this regulation. Now, it shows two things. First of all, it shows that Mr. Han clearly is very impartial, but at the same time, it shows us that Zhao Xuanzi is also someone who values this. He himself, in the historical records, was quite praised, and that he was this very senior minister in the state of Jing, and sort of made a number of very important decisions with good judgment. So this is someone who has also has this great judgment in order to recognize Mr. Han for his impartiality and not feel offended ultimately for having that his own driver be punished. So this idea of sort of impartiality, when we read the records, I guess all of us would agree to it. But when it comes down to us personally, being able to action a reward and punishment without thinking of the other party, without thinking of the consequences, that might happen within our own family. If we had to tell someone off for something that they'd done wrong, that they should have listened to the parents' instructions or something like that, or as a teacher to provide assessment, marking, etc., that's fair and accords with specific criteria, that actually when you have to meet with the consequences of your actions, whether it's reward or punishment, obviously the punishment is always harder, then you start to that this particular line becomes very important. And many people might feel that it's hard to be impartial because of certain people that they like or dislike. It could be because of the connections that these people have that then might affect your own career. It could be because of other considerations at hand. So it's not as clear cut. But actually, the reason why the Exalted Treatise has this particular sentence is because the consequences for not doing so, for not being impartial in reward and punishment, are quite severe. It's not only a demerit for you, but it affects the lives of the other person and also sets the wrong example for others if we are partial. And to give us confidence that impartiality is the way, there is also this related anecdote from the Garden of Eloquence in the same chapter. And it's about one of the students of Confucius. His name's Zigao, and this student became quite successful himself. He became appointed as a judge in the state of Wei. During his term as the justice, he one time had to sentence a man, have his feet sort of mutilated. And this was one of the punishments for a certain crime at the time. So it wasn't sort of out of the ordinary. But of course, if you committed that crime, this was the punishment. Now, later, there was kind of political turmoil in the state of Wei. And Zigao, who was worried, feared for being embroiled in this turmoil, given the fact that he was associated with the previous government, he had to escape. But he got to the outer edges of the city wall, and he got to the city gates. Now, the city gate is important not only for keeping people out, for preventing people from coming in, so it's a form of defense, but also it's also difficult to get out. Now, it just so happened that the man that he had sentenced to have his feet mutilated was now the guard at the gate. And to his surprise, the man offers him some suggestions in helping him escape. He says, look, there's a gap in the wall over there. And Zhao, being, the student of Confucius who knows, about, ritual propriety and what to do as a man of quality or a noble person, explains that, as a noble person, as an exemplary person, they don't sneak past walls. It's not something that can be done. The man makes another suggestion. Well, if you can't move through the gap there, why don't you creep down in the small hole in the wall there? And Zhao replies, well, actually, I don't think I can do that either. The man finally explains, thinks of another option and says, well, actually, there's a house over there. If you hide in there, then they won't look for you. And that's what happens. So the people who are pursuing Zhao come, but they can't find him, and then they just leave. Zhao is able to escape successfully. But all this time, he's thinking about the man and the fact that he was actually the person who sentenced him to this mutilation. And before he leaves, he says, well, I'm quite sorry, I couldn't not accord with the law, and therefore I had to met out the punishment. But wouldn't this be the perfect time for you to seek revenge? I'm quite surprised that you actually helped me escape. And this is the reply, the man's reply. He says, well, actually, because of my crime, the crime that I committed, this actually was the punishment that I had to face. I accept that there's nothing to be done about it, but I know that when you tried to, adjudicate the case as the judge, you had considered all aspects of the law, and whether there were any clauses or circumstances that allowed me to be spared from this punishment. And I was very aware that you had tried your best. And also, when the time came and you had to pronounce the sentence, you're clearly very unhappy. And I saw that expression too, that you didn't really want for this to happen to me. It wasn't because you had any personal feeling against me, but that you just had to do it and you couldn't not follow the law. And so I could see that, you have this compassion in your heart. And that's why I knew that you're a good person, great man, and I wanted to help you escape. And, you can see that clearly Zhao was someone who, wasn't about the punishment, but about trying to find all the ways and to be as impartial as he could. Kongzi here, who is Confucius, it's a different translation. Confucius hears about this, his student. He really praises Zhao. He says, one who is good at leading others allows them to develop virtue. So this plants virtue means allows them to develop virtue. So if you are very, if you follow the rules, the regulations, and you also try your best, and people know that, even if it's some sort of punishment, that you are according by this very objective criteria, then they will understand, and they will be also moved to develop this virtue. But one who's not good at leading, so a person who just clearly has their own personal inclinations, they do what they like. Someone that they like, they'll help more. Someone that they dislike, they'll make sure that they experience more severe punishment. For example, someone who bends right and wrong, who only thinks of how it might relate to their own personal interest. Well, that person is obviously not good at leading and will cause resentment in others because people will realize that there's unfair treatment. So unfair in the person who's being in the person who is being punished, but also unfair in people who are being rewarded. And therefore, you can see that Zigao, despite the fact that he punished this person, was able to help this person develop virtue and think of that virtue. So he said Zigao was acting out of a concern for fairness and this impartiality. So regardless of how how things are in our lives, in terms of the circumstances that we are facing, there is no excuse for being partial in our reward and our punishment, because as we see in the Exalted Treatise, this is a misdeed and leads to misfortune for ourselves. So certainly something that we have to be very clear about. And very quickly, enjoying leisure and amusement beyond measure, that's something that we can all quite easily understand. So, here you can see the amusement park. Clearly, there's no problem going to an amusement park, but, say, for example, you're enjoying yourself so much that you want to stay there after the opening hours, well, then clearly it's beyond measure. The important word here, of course, is what is that measure? And it's not, we might say, well, this is something that was written in the 12th century. Is that measure then different from today's measure? Is the measure in the times of Confucius different from today? Well, the answer is no. There is still a measure. There is still a standard. And that standard is when we stop thinking about others and we only think about ourselves. To enjoy this leisure and amusement, yes, we can do so. But if it harms others, if it hurts others, and we enjoy this to the detriment or even to the frustration of others, then that would be this misdeed. This is so clearly trying to understand the standard or this measure is something that you need to explore, and it comes about whenever we talk about the distinction between right and wrong, good and bad, in the treatise, in the Exalted Treatise, and the other sentences, whether it's the good deeds or this very long section on misdeeds, helps us understand what is that measure. So because of the time, I will. We only have enough time for this discussion today. Thank you very much for your kind attention, and we look forward to exploring the Exalted Treatise more next week. Thank you very much.